Is this the most effective load to lift in the gym to maximize strength, power, and performance? I'm going to take you through the philosophy around optimal power loading. Now, optimal power loading isn't a new concept. It's one that's been around for a while. You don't see it too much outside of professional sporting environments typically, because you typically need some kind of equipment to be able to measure which loads maximize power. And that is essentially the definition of optimal power loading. It's that load that maximizes power output. Typically it's either average or peak, depending on the kind of exercise you're doing. If you're doing kind of jumps and throws or ballistic type exercises, typically looking at peak power. If you're doing things like squats, bench press, you're looking at average power. Now, there are more accessible ways to measure optimal power load now with phone apps. The My Jump Lab, I think it is called, has a bunch in there, like a phone camera you can use for velocity-based training. There are cheap accelerometers you can attach to barbells and things. However, I'm going to take you through why, what, when, and if you should even consider or bother going down this road of trying to lift at loads that maximize power output. So as usual, I've got my laptop here just to run through some of the notes and the studies. Again, make sure you check out the MMA Strength Conditioning Blueprint. That update will be out soon, as well as the update. There's actually a 6-week program after you sign up on the other side, an offer that is being updated now currently as well. And it's just a one-off program. Obviously everything else in the sweet science of fighting underground, and that is where the main programs are. But when we're talking about optimal power load, it is individual, so loads that maximize power will change based on the person. But typically you're looking at 0 to 30% 1RM for jump squats and throws. And typically when we're talking about 1RM, we're basing jump squats off our back squat 1RM and throws off bench press 1RM. For the Olympic lifts, we're typically looking at greater than 70% 1RM to maximize power. Now, I'm gonna run through almost like a debate club with myself, a case for using optimal power load in training. And again, I always love to compare elite versus non-elite athletes, because an elite athlete cohort has better performance and a physical quality than a sub-elite counterpart. Then that is likely beneficial for success in that sport. Whereas if the sub-elite athletes perform just as well or better, then that quality probably isn't that important for success in that sport. So most of these studies come from one group out of Brazil, Laturco, and this one was with his colleagues in 2018. And they took 330 elite athletes. So we're talking soccer, handball, rugby, and futsal. And they measured power in the jump squat and the half squat. So this was all done on a Smith machine. And they found that rugby players had superior mean and peak power output than the other three sports. Now, this doesn't directly compare elite athletes to sub-elite. This is all within an elite cohort, but it goes to show where sports that require manipulating other human beings or manipulating other heavy loads, which rugby does when soccer, etc. doesn't, that it becomes a more important quality to potentially possess. Another study by Laturco and his colleagues in 2020, they found that sprinters displayed greater force, velocity, power, jump squat height than rugby and soccer players across all loads. They also displayed greater optimal power load at greater relative loads, 22 to 25% higher, meaning they were able to elicit higher power outputs at higher relative loads to body weight. So essentially, instead of being able to maximize power output at 50% body weight, they were able to maximize power output at 80% body mass and at higher values. Another Laturco study in 2017, they actually took the #1 ranked WKF Radika. He was 2-time world champion at the time. And essentially they found that he could generate 45% greater mean propulsive power in the jump squat and 7% in the bench press compared to other national competitors. So this elite karateka was essentially an outlier within that national team. And then finally, we have a study by Pereira and his colleagues in 2018, and they took 28 elite female handball players. And when they say elite, they actually took the national team, Brazilian national team, and compared them to a college team. So essentially we're just having national team versus college level athletes. They found that Olympic athletes jumped higher, produced more relative power in the jump squat and bench press at the optimal power load. So again, we have elite handball players in this cohort. They were able to produce more power relative to body weight at optimal power load than the college athletes in this cohort. So what does optimal power load mean for sports performance? So again, we go back to our first study with those 330 elite athletes. They state that bar power output, so we're talking about mean power, peak power, etc., were more connected to better performances in speed and power assessments than the half squats. So essentially the ballistic action of the jumps related or could predict performance in jumps, sprints, and change direction better than their performance within the half squat. And by performance in the half squat, we're talking about 1RM, so maximal strength in this instance. We also have 2 studies by Laturco again in elite karate and in elite amateur boxing, so the Brazilian national boxing team. And they found strong correlations between power output during the jump squat and punch impact force and punch acceleration. So again, we're seeing that being able to display power outputs during these jumps can potentially predict punch impact forces and punching acceleration, so the speed of the punch. We can also look at optimal power load training as an intervention, and we can also look at that versus, say, a traditional strength and power program. So in 1993, this is how far back some of this goes, Wilson and his colleagues, they looked at jump squats. I think most of these studies just use kind of jump squats, half squats, and bench press as their main things. But they found jump squats at optimal power load led to greater jump performance and greater 6-second cycle sprint performance than only doing plyometrics or only doing heavy squatting. Now, of course, we're never trying to just do one or the other, but it is interesting that you can go just on the heavy force side, just on the velocity side, or in this case, right in the middle. And it seems to be that middle style training of maximizing power tended to translate better to performances, at least in this cohort. Now, could also comment on potentially it's a novel stimulus. Again, novelty is a very big training stimulus, and you see great gains when you do something new. So just bear that in mind too. Laturco and his colleagues in 2018, they took 12 elite amateur boxers, so the study I referenced earlier, and that included 1 Olympic champion, 1 Olympic bronze medalist, 3 Pan American Games medalists, and all athletes were South American Games medalists. So we're talking a pretty high level cohort of boxers. So what they did is they actually did a study design where they were their own controls. So they had a preparation period for a previous competition, and then they had a preparation period for the Olympic Games. And what they did is they took the preparation period for a competition that wasn't as important as the Olympics, and they just did a traditional strength and power training program. There was no guidance on what they were going to do in that. And then leading up to the 2016 Rio Games, they did 14 power orientated sessions of the bench press and the jump squat, and they did that with their optimal power load. And what they did is they did 7 weeks of 6 sets of 6. And what they found was there was greater power output seen in the optimal power load training group versus just the traditional strength and power with not much guidance. They also did a study in 2016 where they did 2 6-week training blocks, one with a traditional strength power block, and this was done in a block periodization style. So essentially it was 2 weeks of strength endurance, 2 weeks of maximum strength, 2 weeks of power. They compared that to optimal power load training, where they did essentially mainly half squats, I think, for the first 4 weeks, and then jump squats for the final 2 weeks at optimal, and they did everything on optimal power load through those 6 weeks. And this was in elite soccer players. They found both groups achieved similar strength and jump performance, but the optimal power load group exhibited greater increases in sprint speed and jump squat power. So essentially, they both jumped as high, they both got similarly as strong, but optimal power load improved sprinting in this case, and power when performing the jump squat. So the question becomes, what does this all mean? How do we interpret all of this research and practice? So we can ask the question, do we go down the road of traditional strength and power training, where we're touching on most of the different aspects of strength, power, speed, or do we just throw it all away and just focus on, hey, optimal power load is the key. We want to just maximize power with every exercise and every rep that we do. In my opinion, no. Again, I mentioned it before, we never want to do just one thing. And I want to cover a bit of that in a second. Also, even though optimal power load is highly correlated with sporting actions, that does not mean that training at optimal power load is going to make you better at those sporting actions. Remember, just because something is correlated, again, we can talk about correlation, causation, but in multifactorial or multifaceted sports, we can never throw one quality as the reason for improving another quality. Everything kind of blends together, nothing is in isolation. Secondly, is it training at optimal power load that causes elite athletes to show greater power at heavier loads? I would argue no. I would say most athletes and most sporting teams that I've been around, no one uses optimal power load as a prescription, because if you have a large squad, getting optimal power load measures for every athlete and prescribing off that and then having to keep repeating those tests is time consuming. And that time is needed for training, especially in heavy training schedules when you're playing matches every week, etc. So I'm yet to see someone implement an optimal power load approach purely for a professional athlete. Instead, it is likely a product of their training covering the entire force velocity relationship, where we're talking about surfing the curve. I'm gonna throw a graph up here and kind of what I mean in terms of surfing the curve. The force velocity relationship, it's an inverse relationship, meaning high forces come with low velocities, high velocities come with low forces. That is the inverse relationship. Now, if we're talking eccentric training, you can throw that out the window. You can have high forces and high velocities, which is one of the major benefits of accentuated eccentric training. However, that's for a different video. One of the philosophies around this force velocity relationship is to train the extreme ends, high forces and high velocities, because power is the product of force and velocity. If we're training in this middle area of the curve where we're optimizing or maximizing power during a movement, it means that we have sub-maximal forces and sub-maximal velocity. So we're not improving either of those, we're improving the middle. So a lot of coaches follow the idea that, okay, we're just gonna get brutally strong on the force end, very fast on the velocity end, and then as those two improve, force times velocity, we're gonna improve power. Now what's interesting is a study from Toji and Koneko in 2004, and they found that training across the force velocity relationship, or across the spectrum, surfing the curve, results in greater maximal power than training heavy and light. So essentially, either end training versus training across the whole thing. And I think that's just a good point to make. We never want to not train a quality. We're just gonna train all the qualities, especially for combat sports where it is a mixed sport where you need every quality. You're gonna train them all, but you might just skew towards one end more than the other, depending on the individual and depending on the combat sport, which I'll touch on in just a sec. We also must understand that strength is specific, and it's specific to the loads that you're lifting. A really good example is super squats. And I don't know if you know about super squats training program. It is probably one of the most brutal programs ever created. It's the 20 rep squat program. 6 weeks, you're squatting 20 reps with your 10 rep max, which sounds like it's impossible, but the idea is that you're taking multiple breaths between each rep and you're just grinding these out. But you're doing that 3 times a week for 6 weeks. People report massive gains in muscle mass. However, you do not see an increase in your 1RM squat. That's because strength is specific to what you're doing. If you want to get stronger and improve, as a very basic example, your 1RM squat, you're gonna have to lift heavy loads because the adaptations that you gain are specific to the loads that you're lifting. One good example is reducing co-activation during certain lifts. We want to reduce co-activation, or the activation of opposing muscle group, when we're looking to improve speed. So when we're jumping, we're gonna reduce co-activation of one muscle so the other muscle can contract harder and faster. We need to perform those movements at those loads to see that. So if we see reductions in co-activation at heavier loads, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to transfer to lighter loads, as an example. Now regarding how you should surf the curve, it's going to come down to the individual. So if you spend a lot of time, for example, powerlifting before going into a combat sport, yeah, you're probably going to want to spend more time on the velocity end of the spectrum, between velocity and say the middle of, say, optimal power load. You're still going to do some heavy work, but you're probably going to want to spend more time there. If you came from a hardcore endurance background, you may want to do, honestly, probably a more balanced approach, but you may want to spend more time on the higher force end to develop that strength and some of that muscle mass. When we go into sporting context, I like to see combat sports along a spectrum of strikers being more velocity dominant, MMA in the middle, grapplers tend to be more force dominant in terms of their requirements of the sport. Therefore, training can reflect that. Strikers can be more on the velocity to optimal power load spectrum. MMA can have a balanced approach across all of them, or can be a little more individualized. Grapplers can be more on the force end down to optimal power load. That doesn't mean you're only training in these little zones. It just means that you may do more volume in these zones, and you may just keep a few sets of velocity-based movements, for example, for grapplers, a few sets of plyometrics, jumps, and throws, some lighter versions, as an example. Same thing, strikers, you're still going to do some heavier lifting for maximal strength, but you may spend a little more time in those lower load zones for speed and power. So what if you want to measure your optimal power load at home? Well, you can do that. Again, I mentioned the app. It is the My Jump Lab. That has a velocity-based tracker on your phone. There's also a bunch of accelerometers. If you just search accelerometers online, GymAware is the gold standard. It's more of a linear positions transducer, which has the tether. Slightly different, a little more expensive, but there are a bunch of other ones. I don't know all the names. I think Encode, VMAX Pro. There's probably a whole bunch more that you can just kind of stick on the barbell, and that will measure that velocity for you. But if you're going to do a test, so you want to know the loads that maximize peak power during a barbell jump squat, you want to start with 40% of your body mass on the bar, and you're going to perform 2 to 3 reps, and you're going to increase the load by 10% each set, and then that will give you your profile, and you'll be able to see power essentially increase up to a certain point, and then it'll start to come down. And that peak point will be that load that maximizes power. For your upper body, you're gonna start with 30% of your body mass. So this could be bench press or bench throw. And you're gonna increase by 5% each set. Same thing again, you're gonna plot that power curve and you're gonna pick the top point as optimal power load. This can inform some of your training prescription. It means you're not guessing on a lot of loads when you're doing your maximal power training. Now, if you don't wanna go down that road of testing everything and running through the data, again, those guidelines, 0 to 30% 1RM for jump squats and bench throws. That was from a meta-analysis, but I've seen some research that goes even 30 to 45% 1RM for optimal power load training. And it seems to be the better trained you are, the higher those go. So if you have a low training age, potentially not as strong as you need to be, you might be on the lower end. If you have a very high training age in the gym, you do a lot of power-based movements, a lot of strength-based movements, you might be in the 30 to 45% range. For your Olympic lifts, again, you're just above 70% 1RM, and you tend to be there anyway if you're doing the Olympic lifts, because you need some load for the lifts to move smoothly. If it's too light, it becomes a little janky. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, check down the description for the MMA strength conditioning blueprint. There will be more blueprints coming out in the near future, and I'll see you in the next video.